Hi, I'm Dan Merrick, Ruby's Director of Plant-Based Culinary and Development, and you're joining us today for Ask Me Anything Office Hours, where you guys are able to type in any of your questions, culinary related, and our chefs at Ruby will answer them to the best of our knowledge and give you answers on them and give you tips for cooking. A little bit of house cleaning before we get started here. The way you can actually enter your questions is just on the right side of this video box. You'll see a little box that says Add Question here. Just type in your question there and then click the black button that says Add. Patrick, our moderator, will go through to make sure that they are culinary related and they're actually, they work for the chef that is answering for the day. And then they'll be put into the queue on the right hand side that you can see. And they're basically stacked up on the right hand side in the order they'd have come in. If there's a question that you like that you'd like to be able to have us answer first to make sure that we get through the timing, you can actually hit the heart icon on the right hand side and it'll move that question further up in the queue depending on how many hearts it actually has. So, that being said, let's just dive right into our questions to be able to start out for our Ask Me Anything hours. We're going to start out with Teresa. Teresa, what's your favorite part of being a plant based culinary chef? Well, that's a great question. I've been a plant-based chef, if you will, chef for wow, almost 20 years now. And I've been plant-based for much longer than that, probably about 28 years. Now I kind of fell into becoming a chef, working at a restaurant on Whole Foods, just because I knew how to cook vegetarian and vegan pretty well because I'd been doing it for so many years beforehand. And finding vegetarian options, out and about was pretty tough to be able to do when I first started becoming plant-based, especially living in Texas and, in the Chicago area before that. So, it was a wonderful thing to be able to kind of fall into because I got to learn a lot really early. And after I learned quite a bit from that, one of my favorite parts really is the answer to this is be able, that's actually one of the the best things I can give to people is my knowledge from being in the industry for as long as I have. And that's one of the things that's, for having so many years in the industry, I've seen a lot of different things come in and out of the plant based world, and really looked to explore techniques that weren't used in the plant based culinary world as much, that are becoming more commonplace today. So, 18 years ago when I started cooking with no oils. That was before Forks Over Knives, the movie had actually come out, the documentary. So it was good to be able to start experimenting with that and starting to develop recipes for Whole Foods Market when they started doing a lot of foods in that style in that time period. They don't do that as much anymore, but then they were very big on a program called Health Starts Here, and their food coaches or healthy eating specialists is what they called them. You actually might know a couple of them from Ruby as well. Char Nolan, who's a wonderful friend, was also a healthy eating specialist from Whole Foods Market as well. And that's, I think, probably one of the best things about being a plant-based chef is being able to share my culinary knowledge with people that are interested, through students, through Ruby, just through general life. It's a wonderful thing to be able to go to a restaurant. A lot of times I'll have, chefs that come out and talk to me, and then we'll kind of talk shop about things. Like I was at a restaurant here in Madison, Wisconsin, just a couple weeks ago, where I was very surprised by the dish that we had ordered. Had a tofu ricotta in it that was really, really good. And I make a tofu ricotta all the time, so of course the chef and I kind of traded notes about that recipe and many other recipes actually, and it's just a wonderful thing to be able to help share that knowledge. So that's probably my favorite thing about being, a plant-based culinary chef, is being able to share knowledge. Great question. All right, so Jody, is there an ideal ratio for the different categories in veg burgers? How thick should they be? What should the moisture level be when making them, and how should they feel? When I tried them, they were extremely sticky. Thank you. So this is kind of an open-ended question, Jody, because there are so many different ways to make veg burgers. It's actually one of the things I love about veggie burgers. I'm not a big fan of like the Impossible burgers or the Beyond Meats because they taste too much like meat for me. And after being a vegetarian and vegan as long as I have, that like flavor just really it turns me off. And so I like actually veggie burgers that taste like full of veggies and all kinds of other things in them. But that being said, there's a lot of different kinds of veggie burgers. So, ratios are going to be very different on the different styles. Thickness, typically probably, aren't going to be too thick. Like if you're doing like an inch, tall, that's probably a little too big, but maybe a half inch at the most would be on a veggie burger. But you get also down to a quarter inch for those veggie burgers as far as thickness goes. Now, as far as ratios go, they're a huge variety, but typically, if you're doing something like it's almost like in thirds ish. No, I guess I wouldn't say that. Like it might be something like a cup of grain and a cup of maybe 2 cups of your moist vegetables, and maybe another cup of like beans or something like that. And then, your flavor enhancers and your herbs, and then usually something to bind them with. The beans might be the binder for it, or if you're doing another grain, forward veggie burger, it might be something like aquafaba or something other to be able to help bind that up. Now, on the moisture level, you don't want them to be too moist, right? Like, I mean, you want some moisture into them when you eat them. They shouldn't be completely dried out. But if they're sticky, especially after you're cooking, something's gone a little bit different. They definitely will be sticky when you first make them, though, because they're all kinds of vegetables. Your binding element, whatever you're using, is your binder, which and something else might be an egg, but in the veg world, we use a whole lot of other things to be able to do binding. Beans are probably the most popular for veggie burgers. And because you're kind of pulsing those up, they're going to stick a little bit when you first, make them. And I usually put them in parchment paper to be able to make sure that they don't stick to each other if I'm making a lot of them. So, you don't want to go too thick on them. The moisture level should be moist enough when they first make them, but when you're done cooking them, you don't want to lose all the moisture out of them. So you still have some of that moisture in them. And then, yeah, as far as the feel, you'll still have you'll have a little give when you push into them. Your fingers will sink into them as well. And if you push hard enough, they're going to break apart as well. So a little bit hard of a question to answer there, but some of those things you're going to find in there, and there's no real, this is the end all be all answer to that because there's so many different varieties in veggie burgers. I hope that helps, Jody. All right, Kelly, what is your favorite plant protein? I have a lot of different plant proteins I use all the time, and I'm not so focused on plant proteins as much because I don't think I need as much protein. Like if I were an hardworking athlete, I definitely need more. But just from my everyday eating, I get all the proteins I need typically. Probably my go-to proteins are going to be tofu and like a bean and rice combination, and that bean switches daily depending on um, what kind of food I'm making. It could be chickpeas, it could be pintos and black beans or lentils. And typically combined with a rice, but not all the time. But that's typically, where I'm going. Like, tofu is a pretty big staple in my house where we have it a couple times a week, 2 to 3 times a week, depending on what we're making. But yeah, so I would say tofu and then a bean rice combo are probably my top two plant proteins. Shar, speaking of, great to see you, friend. What is your number one tip for newbies who are trying their first veganuary? So, this is a lot of people will go completely vegan during January, and it's kind of one of those things for health, along with joining gyms. A lot of people go vegan for the whole month, and probably one of the best tips that I can give people is don't you know don't get too upset and don't worry about making mistakes right away. When somebody is first going vegan, they might not realize that certain things aren't vegan, even if they're trying. So, probably one thing I would recommend to people right away is read labels on anything that you're buying that's processed. If it's in the produce area, you don't have to worry about it. But if it's something that's in the grocery aisle, definitely read every label to be able to make sure that there aren't any animal products in them. And usually it'll, have those list of allergens in there, and milk, dairy, eggs, all those things are usually listed in those. But definitely go through the list. If the list is really, really long, it's probably too processed. So you might want to leave that um, at the grocery store. But also at the same time, some people that are first going vegan might need some of those processed ingredients to be able to help make that transformation. And so I might tell people that are first starting out to go vegan is to be able to make that transition at the beginning, to do things like the Beyond Meats or the vegan cheese shreds or stuff like that, to be able to help you make that first step there into that transition. But then by the end of the month, try to transition away from that a little bit more, um, and go more towards a whole food plant-based diet. But so probably big tips are, one is to read every label of everything that you're going to be eating. If you're going to restaurants, ask a lot of questions. It's okay; they're used to getting a lot of questions about things. Um, and then also, take it easy on yourself. It's great to make the transition, but don't beat yourself up if you've made a little mistake over the month. And that's probably a good place to kind of start, if you're just starting out to do this for a monthly project. One of the great things I love about people that are doing, going vegan in January, is what you're doing is making a lifestyle change, and you can actually continue that after January, much easier than if you were just going cold turkey. Like on January 1st, it was really, really hard to be able to make that change, or it might have been for a lot of people. But by February 1st, if you go back and you just eat like a cheeseburger and fries or something like that, it's gonna feel very different to you, than it did right before that. So kind of think about that in the same way, where even if you don't want to be plant-based 100% in February, try to keep a good amount of plant-based meals in your repertoire to be able to keep on that health kick and keep that lifestyle change that you've made, to be able to make that transition for your life. It's a wonderful process, and it's not easy for everybody. I understand that. So some people need to take it in baby steps, and that's totally fine. So great to see you, Shar. Miriam, task 141 of the Forks Over Knives involves a 60 minutes on tomato-based soups. I'm allergic to tomatoes. How will I be able to work this task? So task 141 in Forks Over Knives is it's not actually an activity. It's basically a lesson. So all you have to do is actually watch the two videos that are on that one and just walk them through to be able to see the videos for it. You don't actually have to make a tomato-based soup though. Just getting the information about them is great. To see how tomatoes are working into some of those soups. I can't remember exactly which soups they are, but I think there's like a chili and something else in there. And some of those tomatoes can be omitted from. Like you don't have to have tomatoes in a chili. That's totally okay. But just learn from the task, and then when it comes to an activity, if you have to make a soup, just know that you don't have to make a tomato-based soup. And just as a tip for everybody out there, if you're allergic to a certain ingredient, and Ruby is asking you to use that ingredient in an activity or a task, just know that we're open to you using alternative ingredients because of your allergy. There's by no means would we ever want you to, be cooking with something you're allergic to, or can't eat. We allow substitutions, and that's okay. One of the great things that we try to teach at Ruby is that cooking has to be adaptable, and we'll give you the basic tools for your classes to get you started. But when you graduate, you will change the recipes, you'll change the cooking styles, you'll graduate beyond what we've taught you. And that's something this is a perfect example of. So if you're not going to use tomatoes in something, you can alter the recipe to make it work just for you and to fit your palate and any allergies that you have. All right, next one's from Maria. I'm new to a plant-based diet. How do I let others know that this diet is healthier for you? So slippery slope there, Maria. It's uh, as being plant-based as long as I have. One thing you learn is you don't want to be preachy. And what I mean by that is you don't want to tell people, hey, I'm on a plant based diet. It's healthy. You should do this too much, right? It's great to tell people that the benefits of plant based diet and I'm getting this and this and this and this, but you don't want to directly tell people you should do this because I'm doing this as well. So that being said, if people are asking you about, hey, like you look great. I see that you've done this plant-based diet. Like, what's the difference here? Um, some great talking points to talk about and how a plant-based diet is healthier for you is the cholesterol is just non-existent. Can lower your cholesterol if you've been eating meats for a long time. Um, so having that as kind of a starter, your blood pressure can go down. There are all kinds of healthy things that happen out of eating a whole food plant-based diet as well. You'll find that you get a lot more energy. You get a lot, if you're getting your sleep as well, you're actually going to have a lot of energy with that as well too. But you'll see that your body is going to work a little bit better on a plant-based diet too. Now, there are all kinds of different medical claims out there that I'm not going to get into. Being a chef, I can't really answer too much into those, but there are tons and tons of studies and lots of evidence about how a whole food plant-based diet is so much healthier for you than the standard American diet. And you can refer to any of those, and there are a lot of books on the subjects. There are new ones coming out every single day. I would definitely stick to some of the books that are written by doctors instead of celebrities, if you will. That way it's back actually based in scientific evidence to be able to talk about how the diet is healthier for you. So I would kind of go down those couple avenues, and that with the caveat is, it's great to be plant based, but you don't want to be too pushy about being on the plant based diet to other people who might not be as open to it. So that being said, I think that there's a lot of stuff out there that you'll be able to find that will show you that plant-based diets are so beneficial for your health. All right, I hope that helped, Maria. Jody, on the baked biscuit recipe, it states that flour and milk should be cold. I think I understand the milk, but why the flour? So I'm not 100% sure which recipe you're talking about, but I know the science behind this. So if you're making biscuits, typically your milk and your butters want to be as cold as possible. And what happens is when you are making your dough, you're folding in your butter, into the flour, and it creates you want to cut it up in little pieces. And what it's doing is creating little micro pockets of butter. And when you bake those, they steam and kind of puff out the flour, and that's actually what makes a flaky biscuit. Um, so you typically want to keep your butter as cold as possible until it actually gets into the oven. So if it's stating that the flour and milk should be cold, you kind of want everything to be cold. Now, in actuality, if you did, say, put your flour in the freezer for an hour before you started making your biscuits, by the time you're done kneading it and working it, it's going to probably be at room temperature or above again. So it's great that you're starting with it out as cold, but the important part is to be able to keep those little butter solids, small and as cold as possible. So usually what people recommend is to be able to put the entire mixture after you're done kneading again back in the refrigerator to be able to cool it back down and then bake it off afterward to make sure that those little pockets of butter stay in there and to get that really flaky texture. So yeah, so that's basically the answer for that. The flour, is debatable if it's actually going to stay cold, especially after kneading. But it's every little bit helps. All right, so next one is from Nancy. Once and for all, please tell me, do I have to peel cucumbers? And does it matter whether you peel English or Persians for recipes? Thank you. So great question on this, Nancy. English and Persian cucumbers, you absolutely do not have to peel. Other ones you typically do just because the outside skin is very bitter on the outside. So I typically will, I won't peel the whole cucumber, but I'll do it kind of in stripes down the side just to be able to kind of have a nice look on a cucumber when it's around as well too. So I'll typically peel stripes down around it to get rid of some of the bitterness, but it also has a lot of flavor in it. So I don't usually peel all the green on the outside of the cucumber. Now, depending on the variety and the season, you might get some pretty thick skins on those, so you might want to peel the whole thing as well. But you can usually tell just by cutting off a piece and taking a bite of it right away if it's going to be too bitter. You do actually want to wash off the wax in a normal cucumber as well. English and Persians typically are wrapped in like a plastic, which actually helps preserve them. It's actually a pretty neat process to do that. So you don't typically have to do that on those. At first I was always wondering why my cucumber was wrapped in plastic, but the other alternative is it's usually wax, which you have to wash off, and it's a little harder to get off that sometimes, and can also have that bitterness or kind of that, your fingers will actually stick to the outside of that as well. So you do want to wash off the wax in a normal cucumber, and typically you do want to peel a normal cucumber. But English and Persians, you can eat them just the way they are, and you don't have to worry about it at all. Great question, Nancy. All right, Maria, I like healthy smoothies and juicing, but I don't have good recipes yet. Where can I go to find them? There are a huge amount of smoothie recipes out there. I would probably look, I don't have a direct source for you because I'm not really a big smoothie guy. Healthy smoothies and juicing is uh, it's you have to be very careful about that because most people, when they do smoothies, will just do a lot of fruit and fruit juice into those, which is just adding a lot of calories, but not getting a lot of the fiber in them. You're still getting the nutrients out of that, which is great. But I typically like to be able to get the fiber in that as well. So I'll typically just have the apple instead of putting the apple into something, or the strawberries just on their own, and just to be able to get the fiber and the skins and everything else that's actually into those. So I find that I get a lot more nutrients, I get more fiber out of those, and I'll be satiated more because of that as well, because it's actually digesting in my stomach and it takes more to be able to digest because I'm not having a machine break that all down beforehand. So, as far as healthy smoothies, I'd honestly probably just Google healthy smoothies or like smoothies that are good for you. Um, you know, uh, to be able to find some recipes. I know that there are a couple things like from Eat Well and stuff like that that do some of those, but it's debatable on what you would consider healthy. A lot of them will be, they might not even be plant based. They might have different, yogurts, which you could do, a vegan yogurt or a plant based yogurt in those as well too. And if I am going to do a smoothie, one thing I will recommend is to always put greens into it. And I think honestly, the best way to be able to experiment with smoothies is to start experimenting with your own. So start with a little bit of liquid. You can do a plant-based milk. You could even do water as well, and then put a little bit of fruit into it. Put your greens, maybe a nut butter of some sort, like an almond butter or a peanut butter, and then you might even want to do some other like flax seeds or some other seeds into those as well. Blend those up and then see what the flavor profiles work for you. But just know exactly what you're putting into them. I'm not a big fan of using those powders that are commercially available at all, just because they're so processed. And as far as juicing goes, I actually do juice, but I usually use it for cooking. So if I'm going to juice something, I'm usually going to juice it and then use it in a cooking element and not just drink the straight juice. And again, that's mostly for fiber. I think wheatgrass is probably the only exception to that. Like wheatgrass and ginger are two exceptions where I'll actually just do like a shot of wheatgrass or a shot of ginger. Um, that's probably the exception for the juicing on those as well. But those are usually just straight up ginger or straight up wheatgrass. Sometimes I'll combine them as well. But yeah, so I hope that helps a little bit. All right, so Kiko Lee, what alternatives are there to cooking with oil? Good question. So there are a lot of different alternatives. The number one that's been used for centuries is water. So if you're in any of the classes that are like the forks over knives classes, you'll actually see that's a fundamental technique that we offer. There's also a free lesson in the lessons for Ruby that you can learn to cook without oil. So water is the number one that everybody's used for thousands of years before oil was actually commercially available. But other alternatives are also vegetable stocks. If you eat meats, you can do like beef or chicken stocks or fish stocks as well too. But water, veg stocks, you can even do cooking in things like beer or wine as well. A lot of times if I'm cooking mushrooms and onions for a sauce, I might deglaze the pan with a little bit of white wine just to add a little bit of different element to the dish, instead of just using water or veg stock. So that actually uh, works works great for those as well. So, but yeah, water is probably my number one go-to to cook without oil. If you want to add a little bit more flavor, vegetable stock works wonderful. All right, Cynthia. Have you ever heard that kidney beans are not good for you? I recently saw that and never heard that before. I've heard positive that they're high in antioxidants and are a good thing for your health. Yeah, I'm right there with you, Cynthia. I've never heard that kidney beans are not good for you. Unless there's some new scientific evidence upon that, I would back that pretty well. I mean, kidney beans are supposed to be good for you. In fact, I've heard they're good for your kidneys as well. But yeah, I've never heard anything negative about kidney beans at all. So I'm right there with you on that one. Laura, hi, Chef Dan. My beloved Peugeot pepper grinder, 25 years, seems to have trapped moisture. Ooh, is there a way to save it or is it time to let it go? So, hmm, you know, I'd probably go the rice route if I were you. Anytime you're finding moisture that's trapped into things, you might want to just try just a little bit of dried white rice, put it into, come off the top and put the rice into it, let it sit for, probably for a couple days, empty of everything else, and just have the white rice in there. It could probably be brown rice if that's what you have as well too. Leave it in there for a couple days, then open it up and dump the whole rice all the way out. That should be able to help get a lot of that moisture out of there. That's a bummer that that's happened. I'm surprised, like, maybe somebody was washing it or something that got in there. But that's probably the best way to be able to get the moisture out of there because the dry rice will actually help to absorb. Just like, I don't know if you've ever dropped your phone in the water or something like that. They always tell you to pack it in rice in a baggie. It's the same concept, just you're putting it inside the grinder instead. So that's probably what I would recommend for you, Laura. All right, Ellie. We are strict on carbs due to type 2 diabetes. Uh, no white potato. We limit glycemic index ingredients to 55 or less, or pair blend in more protein to offset carbs. What is the optimal ratio? That is not a question for me. Sorry, Ellie. That is that's definitely a doctor question instead of, or you know, probably a registered dietitian question more than a chef. So I'm not 100% sure what the um or to pair in more protein to offset the carbs. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure on what the optimal ratio would be for that. So sorry, I can't answer that one. Mostly because that's a doctor related question. All right, Jody. The chocolate avocado mousse recipe calls for 4 very ripe avocados. It also states that we can interchange the avocados with silken tofu, but doesn't say how much tofu. I assume 1 block, but don't want to assume any idea how much. So yeah, um, the chocolate avocado recipe. I mean, 4 avocados is kind of a lot for that, which is great. I've made this recipe thousands of times in former jobs and stuff like that. And the avocado is great for that. If you want to do silken tofu, that's wonderful. About 1 block might be a little shy, to tell you the truth. But 2 blocks might be too much. So I would say about a block and a half, to tell you the truth. Um, Now, with the, if you're using dates in it, and you're I don't know if you're using just dates or doing cacao into it, but that's a wonderful rich to be or a way to be able to kind of blend that in. The less dates you have in it, and the more cacao, the more dark kind of dark chocolate flavor you'll get from that as well too. So if you'd use start with the 1 block, see how it goes for you. If it's too kind of bitter, it's not getting quite the exact not getting the exact texture or flavor you want, add a little bit more. And it's not the texture because the texture will be fine. It's just the flavor will be might be a little too pungent. And if it is, just add a little bit more of the silken tofu into it. But you can just start with the 1 block. But I would have a second one on hand just in case, because 4 avocados if you kind of equal it out in ratio, like if what the size would be, you could use small avocados or large avocados, right? So the recipe is a little on the edge there. So I would probably just start with the one and add it maybe in quarter of a block tofu to be able to see how it works for you afterward. Hope that helps, Jody. All right. So Susan, I've been using a quart Tremon, I can't pronounce that, pot to make soups. It's a few years old and seems to be rusting a bit on the rim and overall breaking down. Am I looking for a good quality soup? Or I am looking for a good quality soup pot. Any suggestions? So yeah, if it's starting to rust on the outside, that's not always a good thing. As far as pots go, we don't really recommend specific brands so much at Ruby. Um, and partly because there's just so many different ones out there that work really well, and there are huge differences in um, prices. Like I love All Clad myself. The stainless steel pots myself. One of the best things I can tell you is to stay away from aluminum pots. But stainless steel is probably the best way to go for those. So Allclad is great. They have other ones out there. Like, I mean, you see ads all the time for the HexClad and stuff like that. That's still like a non-stick surface, but there's stainless steel that's in the hex design between it. So you still use metal utensils and stuff on it. But I think honestly is to be able to go to the store, see what varieties are out there, or go online and look for stainless steel four-quart pots. The fancier ones are going to be stainless steel, and there'll be a copper line underneath, and then maybe aluminum underneath that as well too. Just make sure that the cooking surface doesn't have any aluminum in it. But there are fancier ways to be able to have the bottoms to be able to heat up faster or more consistent. But I'm not going to give you a specific brand. I think it's more so to be able to see what works in your affordability, to be able to see reviews on them as well too. But know that I personally use Allclad, and I've built up my collection kind of over years. I didn't go out and buy the whole, I don't know what it is, like 16-piece set or something like that. Buying like one pot, every year or two or something like that is fine because they're really expensive. And I wouldn't recommend for people to be able to start out just buying really expensive pans for that. Work what's in your comfort zone and your affordability. Stay away from aluminum. And if you're buying a nonstick, make sure it's a quality nonstick. If you do scratch the nonstick on the surface and some black is coming off, it's time to get rid of the pan. So just keep that in mind too. Hope that helps, Susan. David, when dicing uniform sized food products, there seems to be a lot of waste. Like when you square up a tomato or zucchini slices, what do you do with the smaller vegetable pieces to avoid waste? Great question, David. So yeah, when we're doing different things in fine dining, and if we're doing things for assignments as well, you typically want to have that very uniform cut to be able to make sure that everything's cooking at the same time. So you do end up with some scraps from that. Now, the number one thing that I use is use them for stocks. So I'll keep like a Ziploc baggie in my freezer, and I'll add all my scraps into that baggie. And then when it fills up, put it into a pot, and then fill it up with water, bring it to a boil. As soon as it boils, I bring it down to a simmer and simmer it for about an hour. And that, after I strain that off, ends up with a no sodium vegetable stock that's wonderful to be able to use for all kinds of different things, from making soups to cooking with them to doing the no oil sautés. Wonderful ways to be able to utilize those scraps. The other thing you can do is to be able to add some of those things into other dishes, so you can cook with them in other dishes if you want to. But the stocks are an easy way to be able to use those things, like the zucchini, the tomatoes, all those, and just freeze them as well, to be able to get those smaller vegetable pieces and avoid the waste completely. Now, a lot of people are like, well, what about all the stuff that you use in the stock afterward? You've pretty much drained all the nutrients out of those little pieces after you've boiled them and then simmered them for that long. So it's best just to discard those when you're done, because you've utilized them. You've used all the nutrients and all the work that's out of them as well. So happy cooking, David. Natalie, I've heard that certain brands of non fortified nutritional yeast tend to have a better cheesy profile than fortified. Is there any truth to that beyond their marketing claims? That's a great question. So let's see. Non-fortified nutritional yeast is usually a little harder to find, and it's usually a little bit more expensive. Now, fortified nutritional yeast usually has B12 that's been added to the nutritional yeast to be able to add B12, which is something that a lot of people that are in the plant-based world do need. Now, that being said, a lot of times when foods are fortified, they're not using the most top end or high end vitamins to be able to put into those. The other thing to consider is that if you're adding something to an ingredient, you're also taking away from the essential flavor a little bit because you're adding something into it. So imagine if you just took your multivitamin, ground it up, and then put it into a food. You're still going to have a little taste of that multivitamin in that other food, correct? So the same thing can actually happen with the B12. They do say that it's non-flavored, which it is, but it's also taking away from the cheesy profile of the nutritional yeast as well, just a little bit. So, is there a little bit of truth to the non-fortified having a better cheesy profile? Kind of, yeah, because it actually has the fortified ingredients into it as well. So it's taking a little bit away from that nutritional yeast flavor because there are other ingredients in it. So, if you want to go the extra mile and buy the non-fortified nutritional yeast, that's great. We typically, like, I mean, you know, growing up in the industry, I've totally had the fortified nutritional yeast probably most of the time, and I've only more recently, found the non-fortified versions. Is there a big difference in them? It's a little hard to notice unless you're really used to eating nutritional yeast very regularly. If you put them right next to each other and taste them, you can taste the difference right away. If you're putting them into foods, it's a little bit harder because you have so many other flavor profiles that are actually happening in the foods. So, a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, and you can make your choice based on that. Hope that helps, Natalie. Heather, taking the gills out from portobello mushrooms, does it matter if the mushrooms were previously frozen? I had to use a knife instead. Huh. So, if you're taking the gills out of portobello, which I do recommend for cooking, because otherwise you end up with like kind of brown soupiness at the bottom of your dish. Um, as far as freezing them, as long as you're thawing them out, the gills should come right out pretty easy. And I actually just use a spoon, like just a tablespoon, like not a tablespoon, but one you'd use at the table, um, to take them out. And that usually works really well, even on frozen variety, like if I've had them frozen before. If you're using a knife, you're probably still doing them if they're frozen, I'm guessing. So, but yeah, you definitely still I would still recommend taking them out and using the spoon in, but just let them thaw afterward, and it should be a little bit easier for you, Heather. All right. Maria, how can I turn my smoothies, juicing, and maybe some plant-based diet meals into a business? What food safety course should I take to do this? All right. So that's great if you want to turn this smoothie and juicing into a business. There are a lot of different smoothie companies out there that do it where you can just order it by the individual smoothie and like a restaurant style, or there are also kind of supplement smoothies that you can buy to be able to put into smoothies. And there are some that you can actually just buy at the grocery store that are smoothies, and you have to like shake them up, and they're very like you have to consume them within a certain amount of days from the grocery store to be able to make sure that you're getting your nutrients out of them. Now, as far as food safety courses, we're going to start offering one at Ruby pretty soon here. So you might want to hold on to that unless you're like looking to do this right away. But there are some great food safety courses we're working on right now that have launched for the commercial sector, but not for the consumer at the moment. So you might want to hold off and or might want to hold off to be able to see that course. Otherwise, there's a lot of different food safety courses that you can go in the commercial area right now. But I would recommend the Ruby one. I've seen it firsthand. It works really well. I've been in it a lot. So I would probably take that one and recommend that one when it comes out. And we'll keep you updated on when that comes out as well. As far as turning it into a business, there are a lot of different things you can do. And, that's creating a whole business plan. And, there's a lot of different steps to be able to make that happen. But, there are a lot of ways to be able to make smoothie and juicing. Just like I said, you could do it from the grocery store, from a restaurant style, or just direct to consumer as well. So a lot of different things to be able to pursue on the business side of smoothies and juicing. All right. So Heather, can frozen fruits be used for breakfast bowls? Thanks. Yes, absolutely, Heather. Especially when they're out of season, like I'm now living in Madison, Wisconsin, it's a little harder to get fruit that's in season here, right? So strawberry is completely out of season in Wisconsin. So I would use a frozen variety of strawberry or blueberry instead of maybe a fresh, because they're going to be a lot less expensive. But the if you freeze them, they're typically flash frozen, and they're actually trapping all the nutrients into them as well, and just let them thaw. Um, and you can just put them into like a little, you know, like a Tupperware or something like that, and let them thaw out, and just have them in your refrigerator so you can add them to your breakfast bowls when you need them. I wouldn't, thaw the whole package or anything like that, but just what you need maybe for a couple days. Let them thaw. That goes for like blueberries, all kinds of different fruits like that as well too. And then you can just add, a couple spoonfuls of them in as you need, and frozen fruit works great for that. Still has the same nutrients, great flavor too. So that's a great way to be able to add them to your breakfast bowls. All right, so Maria, I'm trying to take meat out of my diet. Are beans the best alternate protein? They can be. Like I'd said at the beginning of this, you might not need as much protein as you think you need. A lot of people, when they're first going to a plant-based diet, are really worried about their protein, not realizing that they don't need as much protein as they actually think they do. For example, like a burger typically would have about 20 grams of protein in it, where a bagel has 10 grams of protein in it, right? So you can still get a plant-based protein out of a lot of different things, and you get a lot of protein out of a lot of different plants. So beans, and especially pairing them with a rice, great form of a protein. Tofu, tempehs, all kinds of things like that are more concentrated in the proteins. Wonderful ways to be able to alternate the protein into that as well too. Now, if you're making that switch from meat and you're having a difficulty with it, you might want to lean towards plant-based proteins that remind you of the meats as well too, right? So if you used to eat burgers a lot, you might want to go towards a veggie burger that has a profile that's very similar to, a meat protein, or an actual meat burger. So a veggie burger, like you could do an Impossible or Beyond, but I'd probably go something a little bit cleaner with that. Like maybe even what are they, like the Morningstar Grillers or something like that, which doesn't have as much processed stuff into it. But kind of looking in those ways to be able to make sure that you're getting satisfied the same way you were as a meat eater, but getting them out of a plant-based diet. And then switching to a more whole food plant-based diet the longer you're on the plant-based diet. Hope that helps, Maria. Cheryl, what are the best dairy-free cheeses you have used in your cooking? Um, okay, so I don't use a ton of dairy-free cheeses in my cooking, especially when I'm cooking for other people. For myself, sometimes I'll use them, and I'll use like shreds or something. It's like I do tofu scrambles for breakfast a lot, so I'll do like a tofu scramble taco, and occasionally I'll use cheese shreds. And I've used a variety of different ones over the years, and I've not really found one that I've been like, wow, that's amazing. There has been a couple though that stand out kind of above them. Violife is one of those that I've really liked. Miyoko's brands are wonderful. I just love that brand. They have a lot of great things that they do with those for dairy-free cheeses, especially in their mozzarella's. They do a good ricotta as well. Um, as far as those things like ricottas, I'll typically make my own using a tofu, and that's just like you can find those on our websites too for it's usually like a lemon juice, garlic, different herbs depending on what you want to do, and then like a tofu blended up. And you can use that as your ricotta as well. But as far as like the shreds and stuff like that, like I said, Violife Miyoko's is probably a good one. I love that Miyoko's is actually doing a lot of like oat, like butters and stuff like that too, which is great. But yeah, I mean, Daiya has recently just reformulated their cheeses again. because when they first came out, they tasted like plastic and were really not good. And they've reformulated them probably 6 times since they first came out with their original shreds, which is great. So they're getting better, and I love that they're innovating that all the time, where they keep pushing the bar to be able to get it better. Um, I'm trying to think, there was another one that was based out of California that actually uses the same process to make that they use cheeses. It's out of almond, but I can't remember it off the top of my head right now. But those are some of the varieties that I've tried in the past and like. And again, I don't use them a lot, especially when I'm cooking for other people. I usually try to stick more towards the whole food plant based. But some of those varieties I use at home are those ones. Jane, is there an advantage to using whole tomatoes in recipes versus diced tomatoes? That's a great question. So typically you're using whole tomatoes. I guess I'm thinking you're talking about canned tomatoes here. Whole tomatoes are typically peeled, and then in the can, they're actually great for recipes and for like soups and sauces because they'll actually break down really, really well. And a diced tomato typically is not. It's not going to break down as much as a whole tomato would. So if you're making a sauce and you or a soup and you want it to be really, really smooth, using a whole tomato is a much better way to be able to do that because it'll just break down into that microscopic level, where the diced tomatoes typically do have the skin still on them. They're going to have little bits of that in there as well. So you'll see, even if you blend them all the way up, they have a little bit heavier texture or grainier texture to them than the whole tomato would. That's a good question, Jane. Another one from Jane. What do you do with kale stems? I thought I read somewhere that they're too bitter for stock. Well, I probably wouldn't use them in stock, but you could, depending on the stock. When I was working with the Sarno brothers at Whole Foods, Derek used to use the kale stems and put them in pico de gallo, which I thought was a clever idea. So pico de gallo just is, a tomato, jalapeno, cilantro, a little bit of garlic, and some onion. But he would put the kale stems in that too, just to add a little bit more nutrient to it, and just a little crunch to it, which is actually a great idea for those as well. As far as kale stems go, like that's a great use for them. You can use them on other things, but stock is probably not something I would use them for. But adding them to other things, just like Derek did in that pico de gallo, is great. Having an acid like the tomato in there to help break them down a little bit, or lime juice to help break down that bitterness works well too. So just like if you're massaging kale with a bitter ingredient, helps to kind of get rid of that bitterness. The same thing actually happens with um, the stems. So, yeah, just be inventive with them. Think about what you could do, how you can add them to other things. You can actually absolutely add them to the top of, dice them up and put them to the top of things. The thinner the slice on the stem, I think the better you'll get, unless you want that real kind of big crunchy boost of like kind of bitterness in them. Cynthia, I also recently heard that soy was highly mucus forming. Do you know if that's true? I've not heard that one either. But, you know, yeah, I've not heard that one. So it might be, but I've not heard that, Cynthia. Got some interesting things I have to research after this, Cynthia. So thanks. Jane, do you recommend freezing veg burgers cooked or uncooked? I typically will freeze them uncooked. So if I'm making a big batch of them, I'm typically going to freeze them uncooked so that way I can let them thaw afterward and cook them in the manner I want to. Because sometimes I might cook them, inside in a pan, or I might put them in the oven, or I might put them in the on the grill. And depending on how those are, you don't want to overcook them, right? So I'll typically freeze mine uncooked in their raw state. So I can either let them thaw or put them right onto whatever it is to be able to cook them through. All right. So Janet, hi chef. Can you put potato peelings in your veggie stock? Is there anything off limits? There's a lot that's off limits. That's a good question, Janet. Potato peelings are probably not the best thing to put in a veg stock because, as you notice on your cutting board, you'll kind of get that white starch that basically comes off, and that'll actually happen in your veg stock as well. So you end up with a really kind of a starchy stock. So anything off limits, yes, and that's really aromatic things. So herbs you're typically not going to put into them, so like dill, stems and cilantro stems, stuff like that. I typically wouldn't put garlic, I wouldn't put into it as well. Tomatoes are kind of on the border. I wouldn't put too much, but if, like we said earlier, if you're just doing some, you have just the ends of something you were doing in a dice, that's okay. But think like nothing that's too, over the top, like beets is probably another one too. Like, don't put your beet skins into them because it's going to just turn everything pink. Um, and kind of think of those things that would overpower all the other kind of flavorful hints that you would get into those. Your basic mirepoix is usually what's in a veg stock, which is, your celery, your carrots, and your onions. So that's kind of as your base. Now you can build out from that. So I'll typically put like, red, yellow pepper, cores and tops into my stock as well. I might put a bay leaf to be able to just add a little bit of flavor into it as well. Now, like if I'm doing something like a jackfruit like tortilla soup, I might actually do the cilantro stems into it as well. But that's only if I know I'm going to use that stock for that specific soup or a certain style of that as well. But yeah, just avoid the really, really potent flavorful things or things that will completely discolor or starchy things like your potato peelings. All right, so Toki, it's our last question. Great. So, what is a good alternative for cheese aside from cashews, which are high in fat? I'm trying to stop buying plant-based cheese products. That's a good question. So, in China, they actually use fermented tofu. It's actually they call their cheese, which is kind of funny. But if you've ever had fermented tofu, you will see that's pretty different in flavor than a cheese that we're used to. So you can definitely try that, but I think you'll be surprised if you're looking for something as an alternative to those cashew ones. Um, Cashews are definitely kind of the go-to because they have that fat in them, and the fat is part of what the cheese product is. It's a lot of fat in the cheese. So when you're trying to mimic something like the cheese, a fat is something you kind of want to go towards. Now, if you're looking to be able to get away from those plant-based cheese products, it kind of depends on what you're making. So, like for my example, as my tofu scramble in the morning, right? So, avocado would be a perfect alternative for a cheese and something like that because it has the fat to it, but it also has that kind of creaminess to it and it has a nice texture for something like that as well. Now, if you're looking to be able to kind of just get the flavor of cheese, nutritional yeast is actually a great thing to be able to add to things to kind of get that little umami bite into something that cheese would actually help add to it. So that might be something to be able to do it that has a zero fat added to it, but still has some of that umami and some of that flavor profile of cheese. Now, it's not going to taste exactly like cheese, but it'll get you kind of based in the same area. You can also add that thing, like something like that to like a rice or something like that, the nutritional yeast to be able to make that rice kind of have that kind of umami flavor to it and kind of dress that up a little bit as well. But yeah, that's probably where I would go for those. And the cheese, looking for something that's not in a high fat, a little tricky to be able to do that. But nutritional yeast is a great thing. And then if you're, avocado is probably one of those things to be able to get that kind of texture right for those. I also use silken tofu, or not always silken, but tofu that I'll actually blend up with some other flavor profiles, just like um, the tofu ricotta I was talking about earlier, which is basically a lemon juice, garlic, different herbs, a little bit of onion powder, blended up. That makes a really nice alternative cheese that's zero fat, unless you want to add oil to it, which a lot of people do. But that ends our day right there for the Ask Me Anything office hours. Again, my name is Dan Merrick, Director of Plant-Based Culinary and Development with Ruby. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you soon. Happy cooking.